My son left me alone after surgery. No call, no ride, nothing. The boy I once carried home in my arms abandoned me in a paper gown. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I rewrote every document with his name on it. Insurance, will, everything. Now the payouts doubled. My best friend will inherit, and my son has no idea he's already been erased. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Eleanor Brooks woke to the antiseptic chill of the recovery room, the air thick with the faint tang of disinfectant, and something metallic that clung to the back of her throat. Her eyelids felt weighted, the room still hazy, shapes resolving slowly. The muted green curtain, the steady beep of a monitor, the muted shuffle of rubber soles on polished linoleum. A nurse appeared at her side, checking the monitors with brisk efficiency. "Mrs. Brooks, your surgery went just fine. How's your pain level?" Eleanor blinked, her voice scratchy. "Manageable. When can I go home?" The nurse hesitated, glancing at the chart. "Well, your ride left a few hours ago." It took a second for the words to land. "Left? Yes, ma'am. He said he had an errand, would be right back, but we haven't seen him since." The image of Thomas, her only son, standing in the hospital lobby, keys in his hand, promising he'd be just around the corner, rose sharply in her mind. She tried to sit up too quickly, a throb lancing through her shoulder where the surgeon had worked. "You can rest a bit longer," the nurse offered gently. "Do you have someone else we can call?" Eleanor's pride flared. 72 years old, a widow who prided herself on never being a burden, and now she was stranded in a paper gown, IV tugging at her wrist. The answer tasted sour in her mouth. "Yes, I'll call a friend." Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone on the tray table. Judith Lane answered on the second ring. "Ellie, everything okay?" Eleanor hesitated, then sighed. "I'm fine, I just need a ride home." There was a beat of silence before Judith's voice sharpened. "Where's Thomas?" "Apparently elsewhere." 10 minutes later, Eleanor was dressed, her shoulder aching as she buttoned her cardigan with deliberate precision. When Judith arrived, a navy windbreaker zipped to her chin, hair still mussed from the morning, she didn't speak at first. Just took Eleanor's arm, steady and sure, and led her toward the parking garage. The autumn air hit them in a crisp rush, tinged with the scent of wet leaves and distant chimney smoke. Inside Judith's Subaru, the seat warmer hummed softly, thawing Eleanor's fingers. They rode in silence until Judith turned onto Eleanor's tree-lined street, the Craftsman bungalows glowing amber in the late afternoon light. "You shouldn't have to call me for this," Judith said finally. Eleanor tried to smile. It was outpatient. He probably thought he thought wrong. Judith cut in. Inside the bungalow, the familiar scent of lemon polish and Earl Grey wrapped around them. Eleanor set the kettle on the stove, the ritual grounding her. Steam curled upward as she poured the tea into heavy ceramic mugs. Judith wrapped both hands around hers, her eyes narrowing. "Ellie, you need to rethink your paperwork." Eleanor frowned. "Paperwork? Your will, your insurance, all of it. If he thinks this is how you should be treated, you'd better make sure he's not rewarded for it." Eleanor looked down at the steam rising from her tea, the words settling into the space between them. She had always assumed her affairs were in order, her son provided for, her small nest egg left as a gesture of love. But love, she realized, could be taken for granted. Outside, the wind rattled the last copper leaves on the dogwood tree. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as she carried her mug to the small desk by the window. A pile of unopened mail sat there as it always did after a hospital visit. She shuffled through the envelopes until one caught her eye, a crisp white letter from her insurance company. Across the top, in neat corporate print, "Annual Policy Review, Action Required." Her pulse quickened. The letter still sat on the desk where she'd dropped it the night before, its edges catching the morning light that poured through the front windows. Outside, the street was damp from an overnight rain, the dogwood's bare branches trembling in a breeze that smelled faintly of wet earth. Eleanor slid her glasses down from her hair and slit the envelope open with her old brass letter opener. A polite, impersonal voice in bold print urged her to review and confirm beneficiaries. She carried the letter to the dining table, where her file boxes waited neatly labeled in her tidy looping handwriting. House, bank, insurance. She pulled the insurance folder toward her and flipped through the pages, the paper dry and cool beneath her fingers. Her eyes caught the name printed in black ink on the beneficiary line. Thomas Brooks, 100%. Her jaw tightened. The same name that hadn't appeared in the hospital doorway yesterday. The same name the nurse had said, left hours ago. For a long moment she simply stared at it. The words blurred slightly as the morning sunlight shifted, a shadow crawling across the table. She pressed her lips together, reached for the phone, and dialed a number she hadn't called in months. Frank Mallory, came the warm, measured voice on the other end. It's Eleanor Brooks, she said. I think it's time we met. Of course, Ellie. What's on your mind? My insurance policy, she said slowly. And my son. There was a pause, a paper shuffle on his end. Tell me what happened. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the phone warm against her ear, and described it how Thomas had driven her to the hospital, promised to be nearby, then vanished. The sterile recovery room, the nurse's awkward explanation, Judith's quick arrival, the silence from her son since. She told it without drama, but each detail was measured and deliberate, like laying out evidence before a jury. Frank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he exhaled through his nose. I'm sorry to hear that, but Eleanor, we can fix this. Permanently. She felt the corner of her mouth lift. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Good. Then let's not just change the policy. Let's review your will while we're at it. If we do it right, there won't be any confusion later. The kettle on the stove began to whistle. Eleanor rose, cradling the phone between her ear and shoulder, and turned off the burner. Steam fogged her glasses as she poured hot water over a tea bag, the scent of bergamot rising in slow curls. Frank's voice was steady in her ear. Come by my office this week. Bring all your paperwork. Insurance, banking, anything that names a beneficiary. We'll go through it line by line. I'll do that, she said. They confirmed a time, and when she hung up, the house was quiet again, except for the faint tick of the mantel clock. Eleanor took her tea to the living room, sitting where she could see the street through the front window. The neighborhood was waking, garbage truck growling past, a jogger's shoes tapping against the wet pavement. Her gaze drifted back to the folder on the table, the neat damning line of black ink that had once represented trust. She thought of how easily it could be erased and replaced. She sipped her tea, feeling the heat spread through her chest. Change, she realized, didn't always arrive in sweeping cinematic moments. Sometimes it started with a single phone call and a willingness to put pen to paper. From the desk her phone buzzed, a reminder notification flashing across the screen. Will update appointment. Next Friday, 10 a.m. She smiled faintly. Frank's voice echoed in her mind. Let's not just change the policy. The morning broke crisp and cloudless, the kind of Carolina autumn day that made the air taste faintly of pine and cold stone. Eleanor locked her front door, handbag neatly packed with folders, and stepped off her porch. To anyone watching, especially Thomas if he'd bothered, she might have looked like she was heading to the grocery store, maybe the credit union to deposit a check. She was heading somewhere far more consequential. Downtown Asheville's Courthouse Square rose ahead of her, a stately cluster of old brick and carved stone. Frank Mallory's office occupied a second-floor suite in a converted bank building, the kind with original marble floors, and a bronze directory by the door. As she climbed the wide staircase, the scent of old paper and polished wood grew stronger, a scent that always made her feel grounded. Frank met her at the door with his usual calm smile. Ellie, come in, let's get you settled. His office was orderly, a wall of dark shelves lined with casebooks and framed photographs, black and white images of Asheville streets from decades past. The morning light slanted through tall windows, illuminating the desk where a neat stack of files waited. Let's start with your will, Frank said, motioning her to sit. He opened a folder, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. As of your last update, Thomas Brooks is sole heir to your estate, house, accounts, and personal property. Eleanor nodded once, her hands folded neatly in her lap. We're changing that. Frank didn't look surprised. Tell me exactly what you'd like. Remove Thomas entirely. Everything he would have received I want divided between Judith Lane and a local scholarship fund for high school seniors. Preferably one at Asheville High. Frank's pen began to move. Scholarship fund, do you have a specific name in mind? The Brooks Lane Scholarship, she said after a moment. For students with no family support. Frank looked up then, a spark of approval in his eyes. Done. That'll make a difference for a lot of kids. He slid the document toward her, each line crisp and definitive. Eleanor read it slowly, savoring the way his name was absent from every bequest. With steady hands, she signed, the black ink sinking into the paper like it belonged there. Now, Frank said, setting the signed will aside, your insurance policy, we'll schedule with Megan Carter over at the credit union. She handles beneficiary changes, and she's meticulous. You'll be in good hands. He picked up the phone and dialed, introducing Eleanor to Megan in warm, professional tones. Eleanor listened as he explained the situation only in the broadest terms. No unnecessary details, just enough to secure a time. Megan can meet you Thursday morning, Frank said, hanging up. Bring identification and your policy documents. She'll finalize everything in one sitting. Eleanor rose, feeling lighter than she had in months. The old marble stairs echoed under her shoes as she left, the courthouse square bathed in bright midday sun. On the sidewalk, she passed the bakery where Thomas used to beg for chocolate croissants when he was small. She didn't glance inside. Her stride was brisk, her bag tucked close, her mind turning toward the final step of this quiet reordering of her life. By the time she reached her car, a faint smile had settled on her face, one she didn't have to fake for anyone. She had just buckled her seatbelt when her phone buzzed in the console. The screen lit up with a message from Karen. Hi Eleanor, hope you're feeling better. Quick question, could you possibly lend Thomas some money? Just until his bonus comes in. The message blinked on the screen, waiting. The message from Karen glowed on Eleanor's phone screen like a bill she'd never agreed to pay. She stared at it until the letters seemed to tighten, each word leaning on the next, with that familiar, unspoken expectation, of course you'll help us. Your family. She set the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. The engine purred, the air vents sending a faint warmth toward her chilled fingers. She drove past the old oak in the courthouse square, resisting the urge to craft a polite reply. No response was a response. At home she found Judith sitting on her porch swing with a paper cup of coffee, the wooden boards creaking under her sensible shoes. You look like someone just asked for your kidney, Judith said, eyeing her friend's expression. Eleanor unlocked the door, motioning for her to come in. Close enough, Karen texted. They want a loan until Thomas's bonus comes in. Judith's eyebrows lifted. Let me guess. No mention of what the money's for. Not a word. Eleanor hung her coat neatly on the hook. I'm ignoring it. That's the right answer, Judith said, following her into the kitchen. You give them an inch, they'll take your retirement. Eleanor allowed herself a dry chuckle. The kettle hissed as she filled it, the faint scent of the morning's tea leaves still lingering in the sink. Her phone buzzed again, but this time the number was unfamiliar. Mrs. Brooks? The voice was brisk, professional. This is Megan Carter from the credit union. Frank asked me to call and confirm your beneficiary change appointment for Thursday at 10. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, pen already in hand. Yes, I'll be there. Excellent. If you could bring valid identification and your current policy documents, we'll finalize everything in one sitting. It shouldn't take more than 30 minutes. Her pen scratched across the notepad. ID policy Thursday 10 a.m. She felt a quiet, satisfying click inside, as if another piece of the puzzle had locked into place. After hanging up, she fetched the fireproof box from the hall closet. The latch gave way with a metallic snap, and the scent of stored paper rose up, ink, manila, the faint tang of brass from the box's hinges. She sorted her folders with the same precision she'd once used to arrange college applications for her students. Insurance policy on top, while beneath it copies of her deed and banking statements stacked neatly behind. She was sliding the box back into its place when her phone chimed again, this time a voicemail. Thomas's voice spilled into the room, low and clipped. "Mom, I don't know what's going on with you lately, but family duty works both ways. When we need help, we expect you to be there, just like we've been there for you. Call me back." Eleanor didn't sit down to replay it. She pressed the delete button, the digital tone of finality almost pleasant in its simplicity. Judith, who had been watching from the doorway, tilted her head. "He really left that message." Eleanor nodded, her mouth tightening. "And I really erased it." For a moment they stood in the kitchen with only the faint ticking of the clock between them. Then Eleanor slid her files into her handbag and zipped it closed. "Everything's ready for Thursday." Judith's smile was small but fierce. "Then Thursday's the day the Brooks family ledger gets rewritten." The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Laundry folded into neat stacks, soup simmering on the stove, the low murmur of the local radio station in the background. But underneath the calm hum of domestic routine, Eleanor's thoughts kept drifting to the appointment, to the sound of pen on paper and the notarized stamp sealing the changes. That night, as she set her alarm, she saw Megan's name still at the top of her call log, her voice echoing in memory. "Bring ID, we'll finalize this in one sitting." The pen felt heavier than it should have, smooth barrel, cool against Eleanor's fingers, yet weighted with something more than metal and ink. Across the desk, Megan Carter slid the form toward her, the columns already filled with her neat handwriting, names, percentages, policy number. On the line for primary beneficiary, Thomas Brooks was gone. In its place, two entries sat like guardrails against the past. Judith Lane, 50% Brooks Lane Scholarship Fund, 50%. The credit union's office smelled faintly of fresh paper and brewed coffee from the break room. Outside the wide glass windows, Asheville's courthouse square bustled, lawyers in dark coats crossing the street, a busker tuning a guitar near the steps. Megan, with her precise bob and clear, even tone, tapped the signature line. "Once you sign, Mrs. Brooks, this is immediate and legally binding." Eleanor steadied the pen and signed her name in a looping hand she'd perfected decades ago on student report cards. The scratch of ink on paper was louder than she expected, or maybe her mind had tuned out everything else to hear it. When she looked up, Megan was already affixing the notary seal, pressing the embosser with a sure, practiced motion. "That's it," Megan said. "Thomas Brooks is no longer a beneficiary on this policy. I'll file this with our central office today." A small, satisfied breath escaped Eleanor. She hadn't realized she'd been holding it. "I'll send a confirmation to Mr. Mallory for his records," Megan added, sliding the stamped copy into a protective sleeve. "Would you like one for yourself?" "Yes, please." The paper was cool against Eleanor's fingertips, the raised seal like a fingerprint in relief. Minutes later, she was walking through the crisp midday air, the document secure in her handbag. The courthouse clock struck 12, and across the square she spotted Judith waving from a cafe table, two menus already open. They ordered quiche and hot cider, the scent of cinnamon mingling with the faint yeasty smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door. Judith listened as Eleanor described every step of the meeting, her eyes narrowing in approval at the scholarship's name. "You've done it," Judith said, raising her glass of cider. "Thomas won't see this coming." Eleanor clinked her glass gently against hers. "He doesn't need to. It's done whether he knows or not." After lunch they strolled along the brick sidewalks, past shop windows displaying pottery and quilts, the low sun casting a honeyed glow over the square. Eleanor felt lighter, her steps unhurried. By the time she reached home, the afternoon shadows were long across the porch. She unlocked the front door, set her handbag on the entry table, and the phone began to ring, an unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. She answered, expecting perhaps a telemarketer. Mom. Thomas's voice was warm, almost upbeat, as if the hospital incident had been neatly filed away in his mind under minor inconveniences. Hey, listen, I wanted to give you a little update. Karen and I are getting the kitchen remodel going sooner than planned. Finally replacing those old cabinets. Remember how you hated them? Eleanor eased into her armchair, letting the words run their course. We've already talked to the contractor. Thomas went on. Once the payout comes through, we'll be able to cover the rest. Should make the place worth a lot more. The air in the room seemed to sharpen, the clock's ticking growing louder in the pause that followed. She smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. The payout, she repeated. Yeah, he said, as if it were obvious. From your policy. I mean, that's what it's for, right? Eleanor's fingers rested lightly on the embossed document inside her bag, the one that had erased his name not 30 minutes ago. Thomas's voice poured through the phone like he was already standing in the middle of his gleaming new kitchen. We're going with quartz countertops, white with these little gray veining patterns. The cabinets will be a soft sage green, and Karen found this gorgeous farmhouse sink. Eleanor sat at her dining table, the late afternoon light slanting through the blinds in thin gold stripes. Her tea had gone cold in its cup. She made a sound that could pass for listening, but offered nothing more. And get this, Thomas continued, we're knocking out the wall between the kitchen and the dining room. Open concept. Buyers love that. This place is going to be worth a fortune once we're done. All thanks to you. She let the words hang in the air, weightless and unreturned. On the other end, he waited. She could hear it in the faint hitch of his breath, but she gave him no anchor, no reassurance to moor himself to. Well, anyway, he said finally, voice tightening, we'll send you some pictures when it's underway. When the call ended, Eleanor stared at the quiet phone for a moment longer before setting it down. That evening, Judith dropped by with a loaf of sourdough wrapped in a clean towel, her coat collar turned up against the chill. She listened while Eleanor recounted the conversation, slicing the bread into thick, warm pieces. He's building a castle on sand, Judith muttered. And he thinks the tide's not coming in. Eleanor smiled faintly. I didn't correct him. Judith's eyes softened. Good. The less you say, the better. The next morning, Eleanor opened her email to find Karen's name in bold letters. The subject line read, Kitchen Dreams. Inside was a link to a Pinterest board, an endless scroll of airy kitchens, brass hardware gleaming, subway tile shining under pendant lights. Karen's note was chirpy. We're so excited to make this happen. Thanks again for being so supportive. Eleanor clicked the little trash can icon without opening the link. The message vanished into digital nothing. Later, she stopped by Frank Mallory's office to drop off a utility bill he'd requested for another matter. He glanced up from his desk as she stepped in. How's everything holding up? He asked. She told him about the phone call, the Pinterest board, the unspoken assumption in every word. Frank leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. My advice? Keep quiet. No explanations, no warnings. Let the paperwork speak when the time comes. Eleanor nodded. She could live with that. Silence, she was learning, had its own kind of power. That afternoon, she busied herself with small, satisfying tasks, sweeping the porch, organizing the spice rack, folding a basket of laundry still warm from the dryer. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then went quiet. The phone rang just as she was stacking clean plates into the cupboard. She didn't recognize the number, but the display read Credit Union, Mrs. Brooks. Megan's voice was calm but carried a subtle edge. I thought you should know. Your son contacted our office this morning, asking for details about your life insurance policy. Eleanor felt the air in the kitchen sharpen. Details. Yes. Payout amounts. Beneficiary information. I explained, politely, that without your written consent, I can't share anything. A long pause settled between them, filled only by the faint hum of Eleanor's refrigerator. I thought you'd want to be aware, Megan said finally. I do, Eleanor replied. Thank you for letting me know. She hung up, the dial tone fading into the stillness of the house. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was dense, carrying the weight of what Thomas didn't know, and what she would never tell him until it was too late. Thomas's voice came through her phone mid-morning, tight with irritation. "Mom, I just got off the phone with your credit union. That Megan woman said she couldn't give me the details I asked for without your permission. What's that about?" Eleanor set down the pruning shears she'd been using in the backyard, brushing a fleck of dirt from her sleeve. "It's being handled," she said evenly. "Handled how? I'm your son. This is family business." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of her neighbor's lilacs, though they were long past bloom. Eleanor imagined his jaw tightening, the way it had when he was 12, and she refused to buy him a BB gun. "Thomas," she said, keeping her tone steady, "everything is under control." "That's not an answer. It's the one you're getting." She ended the call before his voice could climb any higher. By evening, Karen was on the line, her voice sweetened with practiced civility that didn't mask the bite beneath. "Eleanor, I don't understand why you're being so secretive. It's just us. You can tell us what's going on with the policy." Eleanor stirred the pot of vegetable soup on the stove, the steam fogging her glasses. "It's not something you need to worry about." Karen gave a small, sharp laugh. "That's a strange thing to say when it affects the whole family." Eleanor replaced the lid on the pot. "Speaking of family, how's your sister? She was looking for a new job last time we spoke." The pause on the line was almost audible. "She's fine," Karen said finally, her tone cooling. "Good to hear," Eleanor replied, already steering the conversation toward the weather. By the time the call ended, her pulse had returned to normal, though the undercurrent of Karen's disapproval still lingered like the aftertaste of oversteeped tea. The next day, Judith appeared at her door with a grin and a suggestion. "You need a break from your own cooking. Ice cream at Whitman's, my treat." Whitman's Creamery was a narrow shop with white tile floors, and the smell of vanilla, sugar, and fresh waffle cones drifting from behind the counter. The bell over the door jingled as they stepped inside, the afternoon sun casting honeyed light through the front windows. Judith ordered butter pecan in a sugar cone. Eleanor chose black cherry in a paper cup. They sat by the window, the hum of the freezers and the low murmur of other customers wrapping around them. Judith licked her cone thoughtfully. "Let me guess, Thomas didn't take Megan's refusal well." Eleanor smiled without humor. "He thinks I owe him an explanation." "Of course he does," Judith said, rolling her eyes. "He's not used to you drawing lines he can't erase." Eleanor spooned another bite of ice cream, the cold sweetness making her teeth ache in a way she found oddly satisfying. They lingered until their ice cream was gone, the street outside softening into the early shadows of dusk. By the time Eleanor returned home, the mail was waiting in her box, mostly bills and flyers, but wedged in between was the folded glossy HOA newsletter. She set the stack on the kitchen table, skimming idly through the pages until a bold header caught her eye. "Upcoming neighborhood events. Hosted by Thomas and Karen Brooks. Summer kickoff barbecue." The date was next Saturday. She stared at the words, imagining the tidy, curated chaos of their backyard, borrowed serving platters, loud conversation, neighbors sipping sweet tea in folding chairs. She could almost hear Thomas's laugh carrying over the fence, as if nothing at all were amiss. The scent of charcoal reached Eleanor halfway down the block, curling through the warm evening air, like an invitation she'd never asked for. It carried that unmistakable blend of sizzling meat, tangy marinade, and a faint whiff of lighter fluid, a summer smell that in other years might have tugged up memories of paper plates and clinking glasses. Tonight it was only the smell of a performance about to begin. Thomas and Karen's backyard looked as though it had been plucked from the glossy pages of a home and garden magazine. String lights hung in perfect zigzags above the lawn, their bulbs just beginning to glow against the fading daylight. A buffet table stretched the length of the deck, lined with mason jars of lemonade and wildflowers, disposable plates stacked in a neat symmetrical tower. Music floated from an outdoor speaker, some upbeat country tune that blended with the low hum of conversation. Karen spotted her first. She crossed the lawn in a sleeveless navy dress that skimmed her knees, her smile broad and rehearsed. Eleanor, I was telling the Petersons we hoped you'd come, she said, her voice pitched high enough for the nearest group to overhear. We've been sharing with everyone how financially secure we are now. It's such a blessing to be in this position. Eleanor met her gaze with a pleasant smile that revealed nothing. That's wonderful, she said, her tone smooth as the iced tea she planned to find. Before Karen could add more, a cluster of guests tugged her toward the grill. That's where Thomas stood, beer bottle in one hand, spatula in the other, commanding attention like a man holding court. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and his voice carried easily over the music. And after the remodel, we're looking at adding a deck out back, he was saying to the neighbor from across the street. Maybe even a hot tub if we budget right. Got to think ahead, add value to the property. Future-proofing, you know. The neighbor chuckled, murmuring agreement. Thomas gave the grill a confident flip, as though every piece of meat had a guaranteed destination. Eleanor picked up a sweating glass of iced tea from the drinks table, the condensation sliding cool against her fingers. She took a sip, savoring the chill, and scanned the party for the one person she trusted. Judith appeared from behind a row of lawn chairs, her wide-brimmed straw hat shading her face from the last rays of sun. She moved to Eleanor's side without preamble, her eyes sweeping the scene like a general assessing a battlefield. Nice spread, Judith said under her breath, the corner of her mouth twitching. He has no idea, does he? Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile. Not a clue. They spent the next half hour weaving through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors about tomatoes ripening too fast, the upcoming high school football game, and the festival scheduled for next month. Eleanor laughed in the right places, nodded at the right times, and offered no hint of the storm gathering just beyond her son's line of sight. From the porch, Karen's voice rang out again, animated as she described their vision for the kitchen to a circle of admirers. Sage cabinets, quartz countertops, open shelving. It's going to be magazine-worthy, she gushed. And with the funding in place, we can finally do it right. The phrase funding in place slipped easily from her lips, as though it were carved into stone. Eleanor kept her expression serene, but her fingers tightened slightly on the glass. Judith caught the motion and gave her a look, a silent reminder that this was all part of the play. When the first trays of dessert began to emerge from the kitchen, pies cooling on trevets, bowls of fresh berries glistening under a dusting of sugar, Eleanor glanced at her watch. She had been there long enough for her absence to be noticed if she'd skipped entirely, but not long enough to risk being cornered for a family chat. She touched Judith's arm lightly. "Shall we?" Judith nodded, and together they slipped back through the open side gate. The moment they stepped onto the quiet street, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner, carrying only the faint echo of music from the backyard. The Blue Ridge foothills were painted in streaks of rose and lavender as the sun dipped low, and the houses along the block glowed in the warm light. Back home, Eleanor hung her sweater neatly on its hook, the faint smoky scent of the barbecue clinging to the fabric. She was pouring herself a glass of water when her laptop chimed from the desk. It was an email from Frank. Subject: final insurance documents. Processed and filed. Message: all updates have been officially recorded. Copies stored securely in your legal file. You are now fully protected under the new arrangements. Her eyes lingered on those last words. Fully protected. The phrase didn't just sound secure. It felt like armor she'd been quietly building for months. The knock at the door came just after 10, firm but unhurried, the kind of knock from someone who expected to be welcomed. Eleanor opened it to find Frank Mallory standing there, a leather briefcase in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. "Morning, Ellie," he said, with a warm nod. "Thought I'd deliver these in person. Figured you'd want them in your hands, not just in your inbox." He stepped inside, the faint scent of rain clinging to his coat. Outside, the street was still damp from a passing shower, drops beating along the porch railing. Frank set his briefcase on the dining table and clicked it open with a practiced motion, drawing out a neatly bound file. "This," he said, sliding it toward her, "is the complete set. Will revisions, insurance updates, banking directives, Everything we discussed. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses and eased into her chair. The weight of the file was satisfying in her hands, heavier than paper alone. She opened it and began reading, her fingertip tracing down the neat columns and bullet points. On every page where Thomas Brooks's name had once appeared, there was nothing but white space, or a replacement line, Judith Lane or Brooks Lane Scholarship Fund. No footnotes, no contingencies. It was as if the ink had reached back in time and erased him completely. Frank sipped his coffee while she turned to each page. Everything's airtight. If anyone challenges it, they'll hit a wall of documentation. When she reached the end, Eleanor closed the file with deliberate care. The relief that settled over her wasn't loud or showy. It was the quiet, grounding kind, like finally finding your footing after walking a cliffside path. "Thank you, Frank," she said. "Glad to do it." He handed her a second folder. "This copy's for your safe. Keep it with the originals of your deed and bank accounts, and maybe tell Judith where it is, just in case." As if on cue, the doorbell rang again. Judith stepped in with a gust of cool air, her cheeks pink from the wind. "Well, isn't this a meeting of the minds?" she said, eyeing the table. Frank smiled. "Perfect timing. I was just telling Eleanor, you should know where the important papers are." Judith followed Eleanor to the bedroom, where the small fireproof safe sat tucked into the closet. Together they placed the file inside, stacking it neatly on top of a folder labeled House. Eleanor spun the combination lock until it clicked shut. "There," Judith said. "Not even a hurricane could mess with that." They returned to the kitchen to find Frank packing his briefcase. "Megan Carter asked me to pass along a note," he said, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "She says congratulations, and that she wishes all her clients were this decisive." Eleanor opened the envelope to find a handwritten card in Megan's careful looping script. "It's been a pleasure helping you make this change. Your beneficiaries are now exactly as you intended. All my best, Megan." She felt an unexpected warmth at the gesture and tucked the card into a small dish by the telephone. Frank left soon after, tipping his hat as he stepped back into the damp, leaf-scattered street. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Less like waiting, more like settling into the life she'd chosen. Eleanor made herself a cup of tea, the kettle's whistle sharp in the stillness. She was just carrying it to the living room when her laptop chimed with a new email notification. The subject line made her pause mid-step. "Kitchen remodel timeline." The sender Thomas Brooks. Curiosity prickled. She set her tea down and opened it. "Hey Mom," the message began, breezy and confident. "Just wanted to let you know we went ahead and booked the contractor. They're starting next month. Demo days already on the calendar. The payout should come through before the first invoice, so timing's perfect. It's all coming together." Eleanor's eyes lingered on the words "timing's perfect." She leaned back in her chair, the steam from her tea curling upward between them like a question neither of them would answer. At least, not yet. The call came just after breakfast, when Eleanor was rinsing her teacup under the warm splash of the faucet. "Mom," Thomas began without preamble, "I need you to help me out with something just temporarily." The tone wasn't quite a request. It had the clipped rhythm of someone laying out an inevitability. Eleanor set the cup on the drying rack, water dripping steadily into the sink. "What kind of help?" He exhaled sharply, as though the word itself should have been obvious. "The contractors need a deposit before they can start demo, and we're a little stretched at the moment. Once the insurance money clears, I'll pay you back in full. 2 weeks, tops." She dried her hands on a dish towel, moving slowly. "I can't do that." There was a beat of stunned silence. "Can't or won't." "Can't," she repeated, her voice steady. His voice rose. "You've always said family looks out for each other. Well, this is me needing you to look out for me for one." Eleanor walked to the kitchen table, settling into her chair as if his words were just another item on her to-do list. "You'll have to find another solution." The sharp inhale on the other end was followed by a pause long enough to make the line feel heavy. Then "unbelievable," he muttered and hung up. Less than an hour later her phone lit up again. Karen's name this time. Eleanor, she began in that soft, deliberate tone she used when trying to sound reasonable. I just want you to understand the position Thomas is in. This remodel isn't just about making the kitchen pretty, it's about increasing the value of the house, securing our future. He's been working so hard for this. Eleanor listened, hearing the practiced rhythm of guilt woven into each sentence. And honestly, Karen went on, I thought you'd be proud to help us get it done. After all, we've always been here for you. Eleanor cut in, her voice mild but unyielding. I'm sure you'll find a way to make it work without me. The pause on Karen's end was icier this time. Right. Well, I suppose we will. The line went dead. Eleanor exhaled slowly, letting the quiet of the house fold around her. She didn't notice Judith's car until it was pulling into the driveway. A knock followed, and then Judith stepped in, brushing a stray leaf from her coat sleeve. You've got that look, Judith said, setting a paper bag of scones on the counter. They asked for money, Eleanor replied. Judith's eyebrows lifted. And I said no. Judith grinned, pulling 2 mugs from the cupboard. Good. Boundaries make for stronger bones. Want me to be on call in case they try showing up in person? Eleanor allowed herself the smallest laugh. That won't be necessary. The next morning, the sound of hammering drifted in through her open kitchen window. Curious, she stepped out onto the porch. Down the street, Thomas's driveway was crowded with trucks, white vans with logos for cabinetry, tile and general contracting. The rhythmic thud of tools and the whine of a saw floated on the breeze. They'd started anyway. By afternoon, a blue dumpster had been rolled into place at the curb, already bristling with splintered wood and cracked plaster. Eleanor stood at her window for a moment longer, then turned back to her book. The phone rang just before dusk. Mrs. Brooks. Megan Carter's voice was calm but carried a note of concern. I thought you should know. Thomas has been back in touch with our office. He's asking more questions about your policy, trying to confirm timelines and details. Eleanor felt her fingers tighten slightly around the receiver. And I told him as before that I can't disclose anything without your consent, Megan said, but he seems persistent. The line was quiet for a beat, the sound of paper shuffling faint in the background. I thought you'd want to know, Megan finished. I do, Eleanor said. Very much. She replaced the phone on its cradle, the fading light spilling through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes in a slow, deliberate dance. Outside, the hammering had stopped, but she knew the noise wasn't over. Thomas's patience had run out by the time he called Megan for the 3rd time that week. She listened, calm as ever, her voice even and professional. I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks, she said, but without your mother's written consent, I can't disclose any details about her policy, beneficiaries, payout amounts, or timelines. Thomas's tone sharpened. I'm not some random person off the street, I'm her son. I understand, Megan replied. But these rules apply to everyone. He hung up without saying goodbye. That afternoon, Eleanor heard his car before she saw it. Gravel crunching under the tires, the low rumble of his engine cutting off abruptly. Through the lace curtain in the front window, she watched him stride up the walk, his movements clipped, jaw tight. He didn't bother knocking gently. The rap on the door was sharp, impatient. She opened it to find him already leaning forward. We need to talk. Eleanor stepped aside, letting him in. All right, about what? You know about what? He stopped in the middle of the living room, arms crossed. I called the credit union. I asked about the policy. Megan says she can't tell me anything without your consent. Why are you keeping me in the dark? Eleanor closed the door with deliberate care. It's being handled. That's not an answer. His voice rose. Do you realize I've got contractors lined up, dates booked, materials ordered? You've put me in a terrible position, Mom. She walked past him toward the kitchen, her tone light. Would you like some tea? I have Earl Grey and chamomile. He stared after her. Are you serious right now? I'm talking about real money, your money, and you're offering me tea. From the hallway, Karen appeared, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. Eleanor, this secrecy is hurtful. We're your family. We've always been here for you. and now when we need clarity you clam up." Eleanor set the kettle on the stove, the faint hiss of the gas flame filling the silence. "The weather's supposed to turn tomorrow. Might be our first frost." Karen blinked, clearly thrown by the change of subject. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Nothing at all," Eleanor said. Thomas let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a scoff. "You're impossible." The kettle began to rumble. Neither of them accepted her offer of tea. They left not long after, the slam of the front door rattling the picture frames in the hallway. Eleanor exhaled, steadying herself against the counter. A knock came less than an hour later, lighter this time, warm and familiar. Judith stepped in with a paper-wrapped loaf under her arm. "Thought you could use something fresh," Judith said, setting the bread on the counter. "Smells like you had a storm in here." "You could say that." Eleanor sliced into the bread, the crust crackling under the knife. The smell was earthy and comforting, cutting through the lingering sting of the earlier conversation. Judith poured them each a cup of tea, and they ate in companionable silence, the tension easing like steam from the mugs. The next morning, Eleanor drove to the courthouse square to see Frank. His office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books, grounding her immediately. She told him about Thomas's visit, about the pointed questions and Karen's performance in the background. Frank didn't even look up from the folder he was reviewing. "Let him ask," he said. "The paperwork is airtight. You could put it through a hurricane and it wouldn't tear." Eleanor left feeling lighter. The certainty in Frank's voice was a shield she could carry home. That evening, as she sorted through the mail, she found the latest HOA newsletter folded neatly between a stack of circulars. She set aside the junk, flipping through the glossy pages until a headline stopped her cold. Community news introducing the Brooks Lane Scholarship Fund. Co-founders Eleanor Brooks and Judith Lane. Her name. Judith's name. In print, for the entire neighborhood to see. She smiled, slow and deliberate. The HOA meeting was held in the old community center, a brick building that smelled faintly of floor polish and brewed coffee. Folding chairs formed neat rows, their metal legs scraping faintly as neighbors settled in, murmuring about leaf collection schedules and holiday decorating contests. Eleanor sat in the front row, Judith beside her, their knees angled toward the podium. Across the room, Thomas and Karen slid into seats a few rows back. Karen's hair was perfect as always, a sleek curtain over her shoulder, but her eyes flicked to Eleanor with a curious edge. The meeting began with the usual droning updates, parking violations, landscaping budgets, a reminder to keep Halloween decorations tasteful. Eleanor listened politely, her hands folded in her lap, the thin paper agenda resting on her knee. Then the chairwoman smiled at her. "And now, Mrs. Brooks, you have something you'd like to share with the community." Eleanor rose, smoothing the front of her cardigan. She stepped to the podium, the low hum of conversation tapering off as neighbors turned to look. The microphone crackled softly when she spoke. "I've lived in this neighborhood for more than 30 years, she began, her voice steady but warm. "I've seen our community grow, and I've watched young people here take their first steps toward college, careers, and service. Some of them had support. Others had to do it entirely on their own." She paused just long enough to let that hang in the air. Somewhere behind her, a chair creaked. "That's why Judith Lane and I have established the Brooks Lane Scholarship Fund. It will award annual scholarships to local high school seniors who have shown determination in the face of hardship. The first awards will be granted next spring." For a heartbeat there was silence. Then the applause began, small at first, then growing into a wave of clapping that filled the room. Judith's grin was wide, her eyes shining. Eleanor glanced toward the back, and there was Thomas, frozen, his hands motionless on his knees. His gaze locked on her, confusion and disbelief chasing each other across his face. Karen leaned toward him, her mouth moving quickly, words sharp and clipped. From the far corner, Frank Mallory inclined his head toward Eleanor, a subtle nod of approval that steadied her even more. When the applause faded, the chairwoman thanked her, noting how proud the community would be to support the effort. Eleanor returned to her seat, Judith squeezing her hand under the table. Behind them, the low buzz of whispers had shifted. Neighbors murmuring about how generous it was, how much the scholarship could mean, whether their own children might benefit one day. Karen's voice, sharper now, cut through the murmur. "Did you know about this?" she demanded in a whisper. Eleanor could still hear. Thomas didn't answer. Eleanor didn't turn around. She sat straight, accepting the polite smiles and nods from the people in the rows ahead of her. The meeting moved on to other matters, but the tension behind her was palpable. Thomas shifted in his chair, a restless energy radiating forward. When the next agenda item began, he stood abruptly, the legs of his chair screeching against the floor. Without a word, he strode toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the hall. Karen hesitated, glanced toward Eleanor once, then hurried after him. The door shut behind them, muffling the sound of the meeting entirely for a moment. The rain had stopped just before Eleanor stepped out of her car, leaving the courthouse square washed clean and glistening. Puddles mirrored the brick buildings and bare-limbed oaks, and the air carried that after-rain scent, cool mineral, faintly metallic. Frank's office was warm, lit by the mellow glow of his desk lamp. He rose as she entered, closing a file and gesturing toward the chair opposite his. "This won't take long," he said, but there was a certain finality in his tone, the kind that comes when a chapter is about to close. He opened a folder thick with documents, the edges neatly tabbed. "I've gone through everything one last time, your will, insurance, bank accounts, property deeds, and I'm pleased to tell you, Eleanor, Thomas Brooks's name doesn't appear on a single beneficiary line." Eleanor leaned forward, scanning the top page. The lines were clean, precise. Judith Lane, 50%, Brooks Lane Scholarship Fund, 50%. Not an asterisk, not a contingency, not a footnote to be twisted later. "And the scholarship fund?" she asked. Frank's mouth quirked in a satisfied smile. "Fully registered, IRS approved, ready to receive and disburse funds. First scholarship cycle begins in April. We've already got the account open and the bylaws in place." Judith, seated beside her, gave a little celebratory tap of her palm on the table. "We're going to change some lives with this, Ellie." Frank slid two smaller envelopes across the table. "One set of originals for you, one for Judith. I'd like you both to store them somewhere secure. If anything ever happens, the transition will be seamless." Eleanor took the envelope, the paper warm from Frank's hand, and tucked it into her bag. Judith tucked hers under her arm with the care one might give to a priceless heirloom. "Let's get these duplicates into my safe this afternoon," Judith said. "That way we've got double coverage." When they left the office, the clouds had parted enough for the sun to break through, casting slanted beams across the wet pavement. They walked together toward their cars, their conversation light now, about the holiday lights going up around town, about the bakery's winter pies. On her drive home, Eleanor spotted the small flower shop tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. On impulse, she pulled into the narrow space out front. Inside, the air was lush with the scent of roses, eucalyptus, and damp soil. She chose a bouquet of white lilies and pale yellow tulips, the kind of arrangement she'd never have bought for herself before. At home, she placed the flowers in a tall glass vase in the center of her dining table. The afternoon light poured through the blinds, catching the blooms, making them glow from within. For the first time in months, maybe years, the house felt entirely hers, not just the walls and furniture, but the space inside it, the quiet it held. She could breathe without bracing for the next demand, the next guilt-laden phone call. Judith came by an hour later, her envelope already tucked away in her safe. They had tea, the warm spice of cinnamon rolls filling the kitchen. Eleanor told her, "I feel peaceful, like the game is over, and I won." Judith grinned. "You didn't just win. You rewrote the rules." As evening crept in, the phone rang. Eleanor reached for it, expecting perhaps a neighbor or the pharmacy. "Mrs. Brooks." It was Megan Carter, her voice bright but edged with something new. "Yes, Megan. I just wanted to give you an update before the official paperwork arrives. Your policy's payout amount has increased." Eleanor blinked. "Increased? Yes, it's due to a loyalty bonus clause. Rare, but your policy hit a milestone. The new amount is substantial. I thought you'd want to adjust your scholarship allocation accordingly. Eleanor sat very still, her gaze drifting to the vase of lilies, their petals catching the last glint of daylight. The legacy she'd stripped from Thomas had just grown without him knowing. The next morning, the rain had returned, thin, steady, and silver against the kitchen window, when Megan called again. "Mrs. Brooks, I've processed the updated payout figure," she said, her voice smooth and efficient. "The official number is confirmed, and it's already reflected in your policy record." Eleanor glanced at the notepad she kept by the phone, pen poised. Megan recited the figure. Eleanor wrote it down, underlining it once. Then she sat back, absorbing its weight. It was not a number one whispered. It was a number that could change a life, or many lives, depending on where it went. "I'd like to adjust the scholarship's portion," Eleanor said, her decision instant. "Increase it by another 20%. The remainder stays as planned for Judith." Megan's tone carried a faint note of admiration. "Understood. I'll update the beneficiary file today. You're making quite an impact." When the call ended, Eleanor looked out at the drizzle slicking the dogwood branches. She imagined the faces of students she hadn't met yet, clutching acceptance letters they could now afford to act on. The thought landed warmer than any self-congratulation ever could. That evening, Judith insisted on celebrating. "We're going to the River Arts District," she said, calling Eleanor from her car. "You've just turned your insurance into a legacy. This deserves more than tea and toast." The restaurant Judith chose was tucked into a renovated warehouse, its brick walls lined with local paintings, the air carrying the mingled scents of garlic, charred vegetables, and baking bread. A jazz trio played in the corner, the upright bass pulsing softly beneath the clink of cutlery. Over plates of seared trout and roasted potatoes, Judith raised her glass of red wine. "To the Brooks Lane Scholarship. May it outlive the both of us." Eleanor lifted her own glass of sparkling water, the bubbles rising in slow streams. "And to knowing where your money goes." They lingered over dessert, pecan tart with a drizzle of bourbon caramel, while the rain turned to mist outside, blurring the streetlights into soft halos. By the time Eleanor returned home, her coat carried the faint aroma of the restaurant, a mix of rosemary and warmth that clung pleasantly in the hallway. Her phone blinked with 3 missed calls, all from Thomas. She set her purse on the console and walked past it without picking it up. 5 minutes later it rang again. She let it go to voicemail. His voice came through, louder this time, the edge sharper. "Mom, I don't know what's going on, but avoiding my calls isn't helping. This remodel is on a tight schedule, and I need to know when the funds are coming. Call me back tonight." She didn't. The following morning the phone buzzed with a text from Karen. The message stretched across the screen, a carefully composed guilt trip wrapped in faux warmth. "Eleanor, I'm worried about the strain this is putting on your relationship with Thomas. He's been under so much pressure lately, and it's heartbreaking to see him this stressed. You've always been his safety net. Please don't make him feel abandoned now." Eleanor read it once, then again, her thumb hovering for only a second before she tapped delete. The message disappeared, taking its manufactured sentiment with it. She spent the rest of the morning in small, deliberate comforts, watering the ferns in the sunroom, rearranging the books on her shelves, baking a batch of oatmeal cookies. Outside, the drizzle had finally lifted, leaving the air crisp and the Blue Ridge foothills visible in the distance, their slopes fading into winter gray. After lunch she brought the cookies to Judith's house, sharing them over coffee at the kitchen table. They spoke about everything except Thomas, about the scholarship, the garden club, the old movie theater reopening downtown. The absence of his name in conversation was its own relief. Back home, she sorted the day's mail at the dining table. Bills, a seed catalog, a flyer for gutter cleaning, and then an envelope she didn't recognize. Heavy cream stock, her name written in an elegant navy script. Inside was a glossy travel brochure, the cover photograph showing a massive cruise ship gliding through icy blue waters, snow-capped peaks rising in the background. Across the top, in bold lettering, "Experience Alaska. the adventure of a lifetime. The folded pages spilled with images of glaciers, wildlife, and sunlit decks. At the bottom corner, a sticky note in tidy handwriting, "Thought of you, Eleanor." Eleanor smiled, the faint hum of anticipation settling in her chest. The brochure lay open on the dining table, its glossy pages catching the late morning light. Eleanor ran her fingers over the photo of the cruise ship, the blue of the Alaskan waters so vivid it almost shimmered. She had not been north of Virginia in years, and certainly never that far. When Judith stopped by with a bag of fresh apples, Eleanor slid the brochure across the table. "What do you think about this?" Judith leaned over, scanning the itinerary. Glacier Bay whale watching, 7 nights. "Ellie, if you don't book this, I'll do it myself and leave you behind." Eleanor's laugh was quick and genuine. "Then I suppose we'd better book it together." By that afternoon, the deposit was paid, the confirmation email printed and tucked into a folder labeled Travel, 2025. The ship would sail in 3 months. Enough time to anticipate without rushing. Packing began almost immediately, not in the frantic, last-minute way of old trips, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm. A sturdy suitcase appeared on the spare bed. Beside it, a growing collection of sweaters, walking shoes, and a new rain jacket the color of sea glass. Each item folded neatly, as if the act of packing itself was part of the journey. A week later, running errands, Eleanor found herself driving past the Regional Medical Center, the same low brick building where this entire chain of events had begun. She stopped at a red light just opposite the main entrance. Through the sliding glass doors, a steady trickle of patients came and went. She watched for a moment, remembering the sterile chill of the recovery room, the nurse's awkward words, "Your ride left hours ago." The memory rose without heat this time. No bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of a turning point. She had walked into that hospital one person and walked out, thanks to Judith's steady arm, someone else entirely. The light turned green. She drove on. That evening, she sat at her writing desk with a note card and her favorite pen. Her handwriting flowed in careful loops. "Dear Megan, thank you for your discretion, your patience, and your precision. Because of your professionalism, I was able to make decisions on my own terms. That is a gift I won't forget." She slipped the card into an envelope, sealing it with a small press of her thumb. Tomorrow it would go in the mail. On the morning of the cruise, she and Judith set out early for the airport. The car's trunk was loaded with suitcases, the air inside the vehicle warm with the faint scent of the cinnamon rolls Judith had insisted they bring for the flight. The drive took them through the Blue Ridge foothills, where winter's bare trees stood etched against a pale sky. The mountains rolled out in soft layers, blue fading into gray, each ridge a little more distant than the last. Sunlight caught on patches of frost along the roadside, glittering briefly before the warmth of the day dissolved it. They didn't speak much on that drive. It wasn't necessary. The hum of the tires on the road, the rise and fall of the hills, and the shared anticipation in the air said more than conversation could. As they reached the final stretch toward the airport, Eleanor rested her hand lightly on the armrest between them. In her mind, she saw the chain of moments that had led here. The nurse's concerned face, Judith's arrival at the hospital, Frank's quiet competence, Megan's careful professionalism, and somewhere far down that list, Thomas's absence, the unanswered calls, the deleted messages. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a cleared space. The ship would carry her north in a few days, through waters she'd never seen, past ice fields older than memory. But the real voyage had already begun the moment she'd taken back the wheel of her own life. As they pulled into the long-term parking lot, Eleanor smiled to herself, the words forming as naturally as breath. The best rides aren't given, they're taken back mile by mile.